It was a quiet night in the city. The streets were still, save for the hum of distant traffic and the occasional flicker of streetlights casting long shadows over the sidewalks. Daniel Carter had just wrapped up a late meeting and was walking home, the weight of the day's decisions heavy on his mind. He was dressed casually, a simple hoodie and jeans, with a hood pulled up to block out the chill of the night air. He wasn't in any rush. The night felt calm, almost peaceful, and Daniel didn't mind walking to clear his head. As he passed by the luxury car dealership, a sleek modern building with rows of high-end sports cars lined up like an exotic parade, something caught his eye. It wasn't the cars themselves, though they were impressive enough. It was the silence that had settled over the showroom. The doors were locked, but the lights were still on, casting a glossy sheen over the polished metal of a nearby Lamborghini. It was almost like the cars were waiting for someone who would appreciate their worth. Daniel wasn't planning on buying anything tonight. Hell, he didn't even need a new car. But there was something about the opulence of the place that piqued his curiosity. He stood by the windows, just looking. His breath fogged up the glass for a moment, and he wiped it away with his sleeve. Inside, the sales staff was bustling around, busy with the task of tidying up for the night. But one of them, a tall man with slicked-back hair and a sharp suit, immediately noticed Daniel standing outside. His eyes narrowed, as if sizing him up, and Daniel could almost feel the judgment in the air. He didn't think much of it at first. After all, he was just some guy off the street, right? Not the type you'd expect to stroll into a dealership like this. But as Daniel stood there, a cold sense of discomfort started to settle in. He was aware of the way the salespeople's glances shifted toward him, the way the security guards subtly moved closer. A few moments passed before the door to the showroom opened, the familiar ding of the bell marking the entrance. The tall salesman stepped outside, a smile already forming on his face, though it was forced, like he was trying to maintain politeness despite his apparent skepticism. "Can I help you, sir?" The words were smooth, practiced, but there was an underlying tone of condescension. Daniel nodded casually, offering a small, friendly smile. "Just looking around. I'm interested in some of your models." The salesman's eyes flickered briefly over Daniel's attire before he gave a small nod, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Of course. I'll let you take a look, but, I'm afraid we're closing soon." Daniel didn't mind. He wasn't here to waste anyone's time after all. He just wanted to see the cars up close. The way they gleamed under the showroom lights was almost mesmerizing. It felt like being in a different world, a world where he didn't have to think about the responsibilities that came with owning things like this. But the longer he stood there, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The salespeople were whispering among themselves, and one of the security guards, tall and broad-shouldered, was now standing at the edge of the showroom, watching him intently. Daniel wasn't an idiot. He could tell what was happening. The assumptions, the judgment. They didn't think he belonged here. He wasn't stupid enough to think that he was immune to prejudice. But something about the way they treated him, like he was some kind of nuisance, stung. It wasn't just about the clothes he wore. It was about the way people saw him, as if his worth could be determined by the label on his hoodie or the shoes on his feet. A soft chuckle slipped from Daniel's lips, almost involuntary. It wasn't funny. It was more bitter. The contrast between the cars inside the showroom and the man they thought he was couldn't have been starker. "You're not planning on buying anything, are you?" The voice came from behind him, a sharp, dismissive tone. It was the salesman, standing just a little too close. Daniel turned, his expression calm, but his mind already working. "I'm just browsing," he replied, his voice steady, as if nothing was amiss. But the salesman's eyes narrowed, scanning him from head to toe. "We get a lot of window shoppers. Most people who come through here, they've got something to prove." Daniel raised an eyebrow. That was a line he hadn't expected. But before he could respond, the salesman was already turning, a dismissive wave over his shoulder. "Feel free to look. But I'm not sure you're in the right place," the salesman said, his back now to Daniel as he walked away. Daniel stood there for a moment, the sting of those words echoing in his chest. But he wasn't about to let that stop him. He hadn't come here to prove anything to anyone, but he wasn't going to let them push him around either. He took a slow breath and turned his attention back to the cars, letting the silence settle around him once again. He wasn't done with this place, not by a long shot. The showroom was quiet again, except for the soft shuffle of shoes on the polished floors and the occasional hum of fluorescent lights above. Daniel couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his chest. It was the way they looked at him, the salespeople, the security guards. The way they assumed he was just some guy and nobody who didn't belong. He wandered slowly from car to car, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of a Ferrari, his gaze lingering on the sleek lines of a Porsche. He could feel the eyes of the staff on him, watching, waiting for him to leave. But he wasn't going to. Not yet. He knew the game they were playing. They thought he was just a passerby, someone who didn't have the means to afford a car like this, someone who didn't belong in the world they inhabited. They were wrong. After a few minutes of silence, the tall salesman with the slicked-back hair reappeared, this time accompanied by another man, shorter but just as well-dressed, with an air of arrogance that made Daniel's skin crawl. The first man approached Daniel with a forced smile, his eyes never meeting Daniel's for too long. "Sir," the salesman began, his voice dripping with insincerity, "I see you're taking a look at some of our higher-end models. I'd be happy to assist you if you're ready to make a decision." Daniel's fingers hovered over the smooth, polished surface of a Lamborghini Aventador. "I'm just browsing for now," he replied, his voice calm, his tone almost too friendly. He wasn't about to let them rush him, not after what had happened. The salesman's smile faltered, just for a split second, but was enough for Daniel to notice. "Well," the salesman continued, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice, "we do have some, more affordable models if you're interested. Maybe something a bit more suited for your needs." The second man, the one with the smug grin, crossed his arms and looked Daniel up and down. There was no attempt to hide the judgment in his eyes. "I mean, you've got to be realistic about these things," he said, his tone condescending. "It's not like you're in a position to make a big purchase, right?" Daniel's chest tightened. The assumption that he couldn't afford these cars, that he didn't belong here, was infuriating, but he kept his cool. He'd been in situations like this before, many times, but it always stung. This was different, though. This was personal. He took a deep breath and turned to face them, his eyes locking with the salesman's. "You don't know anything about me." The tall salesman blinked, caught off guard by Daniel's sudden assertiveness. "Excuse me," he asked, though it was clear he wasn't ready to back down. "I said you don't know anything about me," Daniel repeated, his voice steady but firm. "You don't know what I can afford, or what I've built." The shorter man, the one who had been silently judging, stepped forward. "What, you think just because you're standing in front of a fancy car, we're going to believe you're a serious buyer?" "Please." He laughed, the sound grating on Daniel's nerves. "You should know your place." Daniel could feel the anger rising, but he forced it down. He wasn't going to let them provoke him into something petty. Instead, he took another step closer to the cars, moving with purpose. "I'm not here for your approval," he said quietly. "But you're right about one thing. I do know my place." The tall salesman, looking a little more agitated now, tried to steer the conversation back to sales. "Well, sir, I really must insist that you take a seat and look over some brochures. If you're not ready to make a purchase now, we can still help you with a financing plan, or—" "I'm not here for brochures," Daniel interrupted. "I'm here to look at the cars. I'm not here to waste anyone's time." The tension between them thickened, the air crackling with unspoken judgments and assumptions. For a moment, Daniel wondered if they would call security again. But before he could even entertain the thought, the shorter man made a move that Daniel hadn't expected. The guy reached over and slapped the brochure down on the hood of a nearby Aston Martin, his fingers digging into the surface of the car like he was marking territory. The arrogance in his voice was almost palpable. "Look, I've got other clients to attend to. So, unless you're serious about buying, I think you should get going." The words stung more than they should have. It wasn't just the dismissal. It was the way he said it, like Daniel's presence was an inconvenience, a disruption of the high-end atmosphere they were trying to maintain. Like he didn't deserve to even be in the same room with these cars. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring at the salesman who thought they could push him around. But the longer he stood there, the more something shifted inside him. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. He wasn't just a customer to be dismissed because of what he was wearing or how they perceived him. He knew better. The moment of hesitation passed. Daniel straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he took one last look at the car he had been admiring. It was beautiful, impossibly sleek, impossible to ignore. And in that moment, it wasn't just the car he wanted. It was something more. Something bigger. "You want me to leave?" Daniel said, his voice low but clear. "Fine. I'll leave." But you're going to regret this. The taller salesman was about to say something more, but before he could open his mouth, Daniel turned and started to walk toward the door, his steps deliberate and measured. The bell above the door jingled again as he exited, the cool night air rushing to meet him. But even as he stepped out onto the sidewalk, he could feel their eyes on him, their judgment still lingering in the air. Daniel didn't look back. Not yet. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Daniel walked away from the dealership, but the tension in his chest hadn't lifted. It was like a storm had settled inside him, waiting to burst. He could still hear their dismissive tones, their assumptions, and it gnawed at him. They had underestimated him. No worse, they humiliated him for no reason other than the way he looked, the way he dressed. He knew that feeling. It wasn't new. He'd grown up with it, and it had shaped him in ways he didn't always like to admit. But tonight it felt different. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a clear case of someone looking at him and deciding he wasn't worth their time because of his appearance. And that wasn't something he was about to let slide. But Daniel wasn't a man of impulsive decisions. He knew how to bide his time, how to wait for the right moment. And the right moment was coming. He could feel it. He stood at the corner of the block, just out of sight of the dealership's entrance. He let out a deep breath, taking a moment to steady himself. As much as he wanted to march back inside and confront them, he knew it would only give them the satisfaction of seeing him flustered. He'd play it differently. A few minutes passed before he spotted a familiar figure, a man in a crisp suit walking down the sidewalk, his shoes clicking with authority against the pavement. It was the same salesman who had made all those assumptions about him. The one with the slicked back hair, the one who had been so dismissive. He was alone, heading to a black SUV parked just up the street. A smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's lips. He followed at a distance, careful not to make his presence obvious. He had learned long ago that the best revenge wasn't always the loudest. Sometimes it was the quiet moments that spoke the loudest. The salesman reached his car, unlocking it with a press of a button, and slipped inside. He wasn't looking around. He was too busy checking his phone, too distracted by the messages he was receiving to notice Daniel closing the distance. Without a second thought, Daniel approached the car, his footsteps light but purposeful. He stopped just short of the vehicle, his breath fogging up the windows as he peered inside. "Hey man," Daniel called, his voice loud enough to catch the salesman's attention. The salesman looked up, startled. His eyes immediately narrowed as he saw Daniel standing there, a scowl replacing the confident smile that had been plastered on his face earlier. "What do you want?" He spat, his voice sharp, annoyed. "Funny," Daniel replied, his tone cool and composed. "I was just wondering how someone so, well, eager to judge someone else could get so easily rattled." The salesman blinked, confusion flashing in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Daniel took a step closer, leaning slightly toward the driver's side window. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice low now. "That attitude you had back at the dealership? The assumption that just because I wasn't dressed like a millionaire, I couldn't possibly be one? That I didn't deserve to be in the same space as you?" "Yeah, I remember that." The salesman's jaw clenched. He looked like he wanted to say something, but his words got stuck. His eyes darted around, like he was trying to figure out how to get out of the situation without looking bad. It was clear that he didn't know how to handle this. "Here's the thing," Daniel continued, a cold smile spreading across his face. "I don't need to prove anything to you or anyone else. But I do believe in standing up for myself when someone tries to belittle me. I think that's something we can both agree on, right?" For a moment, the salesman just stared at him, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Then, as if he couldn't take the pressure anymore, he finally broke the silence. "You think you're so special, don't you?" he sneered. "Just because you got a couple of lucky breaks in life doesn't mean you're anything to me. You're just another guy with a chip on his shoulder." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you think? That I'm just a guy with a chip on my shoulder?" The salesman's face flushed with anger. "You think you can talk down to me? You think just because you walked into that dealership, I'm supposed to kiss your ass?" Daniel leaned in even closer, his face inches from the window now. "I don't need you to kiss my ass," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm not going to sit here and let you treat me like dirt either. I've earned every bit of success I've had, and I don't need your approval to know my worth." The salesman opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat as a realization dawned on him. Daniel wasn't just any guy off the street. He wasn't someone he could belittle, someone he could push aside. No, Daniel was a force, someone who had built an empire from the ground up. That was the moment it hit him. "You," the salesman said, his voice suddenly small. You're not just some guy." Daniel straightened up, taking a step back, his hands slipping into the pockets of his hoodie. "No, I'm not. And you should have known better than to assume I was." Just as the salesman opened his mouth to say something else, Daniel turned and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate, savoring the silence that had fallen between them. He could feel the salesman's eyes on his back, and for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to enjoy the weight of the shift in power. They had tried to humiliate him, but now it was their turn to feel small. He didn't need to rub it in. He didn't need to say anything else. The message had been sent. And as he walked away, a thought occurred to him. Maybe the real revenge wasn't in proving them wrong. Maybe it was just in walking away, knowing they would never forget the lesson.